Everyone. All right, so today we are finally getting around to the Angela Davis essay, um, Racism, Birth Control, and Reproductive Rights. And I'm not going to try and give a long introduction to this. I have some of those recorded, which I haven't released yet, as I didn't feel great about them. As I said in the Zoom, I think that we're trying to cram too much into this one lecture, and my feeling is that we have discussed the idea of systemic racism in different contexts throughout the semester, and for now, I'm going to refer you to the essay on the syllabus, the Ta-Nehisi Coates case for reparations, as an excellent example of a piece of writing that outlines sort of many different facets of the systemic discrimination against the Black community, Black people in general in the United States. But that is certainly going to be a major theme in the Angela Davis essay that we're looking at today: racism, birth control, and reproductive rights. Uh, and I think we will see the the fact of systemic discrimination through an analysis of this essay, certainly. So we're going to leave that Ta-Nehisi Coates essay, The Case for Reparations, as a supplement. Strongly encourage you to read it. It is the essay that made him famous. Ta-Nehisi Coates is one of the most prominent Black intellectuals, Black writers out there today. His book, Between the World and Me, is also an excellent read if you're interested in reading more about systemic racism, the Black experience in the United States, and getting in touch with some of the key texts in discussions about not just systemic discrimination, systemic racism, but white privilege and those ideas. So I want to preface the Angela Davis essay also with just one more brief comment, kind of ellipsis that we won't really be able to get into. This essay is also the way that we're thinking about birth control, reproductive rights, and hence abortion, right? Now, abortion is the sort of topic that you would expect to be covered in an ethics class. And generally, when you talk about abortion in an ethics class, and the way that I've done it in the past, for years, in fact, is to present two sides in the abortion debate: the pro-life and the pro-choice arguments, right? And if you're interested in that element of the debate, the ethics of the personal choice of having an abortion, the ethics of laws permitting individuals to choose to have abortions. There are several essays out there, and let me see if I can. I'm blanking on the names of them, so I'll send those to you in an email. Sorry. But what we're going to do today is not focus on abortion as an individual right, but instead think about forget it. I can't believe I'm blanking on the names of those authors. One is, uh, anyway, we're doing it differently this time around. Um, we are not going to think about uh, abortion in terms of an individual choice. Uh, we're not going to think of the ethics of um, whether or not an individual has the right to an abortion. Um, and we aren't going to think about uh, the topic of abortion as this sort of, you know, controversy with two sides. I think personally that there are um, legitimate arguments on both sides of the debate, right? If you interpret a fetus to have uh, human rights, and you believe that that fetus's right to life trumps the mother's right to have control over her own body. Um, I think that is an argument that you can make, and certainly if you're a woman, I think it is um, an ethical choice that you make for yourself. Um, if, on the other hand, you think that a fetus is not a human, doesn't rise to the level of having human rights, that is also a justifiable understanding of what a fetus is, how rights are conferred, and if you think that a woman's right to do with her body as she sees fit is a stronger right than the claim to the right to live of a fetus, then that is also justifiable in different ways. Uh, so, what instead I want to do is think about abortion in the context of uh, the movement for women's liberation, women's empowerment, and specifically to think about how that movement has developed historically. And this essay in particular examines some of the flaws, shortcomings of the women's rights movement from the beginning. And in particular, it is thinking about a missed opportunity uh, within the women's rights movement to be uh, genuinely all inclusive, which is to say, what Angela Davis is doing in this essay is pointing out the way that the women's liberation movement has a history of excluding Black women, alienating Black women from the movement, and the ways that the movement for birth control and reproductive rights has often or has a history of working in tandem with racist agendas. So, from the outset, we will be thinking about abortion, reproductive rights, the right to plan pregnancies as a part of the women's liberation movement, the movement for women's rights. And we will thus be understanding the attempt to prohibit women from making the individual choice to have an abortion as part of the movement against uh, women's rights and women's liberation, right? So, leaving aside the question of an individual's ethical decision about whether or not abortion is for them, right? If they believe that abortion is ethical or not, uh, we can leave that as an individual question and think about um, the right to choose to have an abortion, the right to make that individual choice in the context of this larger historical movement for women's liberation. Right? And so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in the essay um, to uh, think about why abortion and and reproductive rights are part of women's liberation in general. Right? So, um, women's liberation is a movement that sort of begins, as Davis explains, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and it culminates. That period of it culminates in uh, the women's suffrage movement and the winning the right to vote, which was achieved in 1919. Uh, and so, why is reproductive rights part of this broader movement for women's liberation? Um, Angela Davis writes on page 356. It was not a coincidence that women's consciousness of their reproductive rights was born within the organized movement for women's political equality. Right? So it's not a coincidence that the movement for reproductive rights was born uh, within the movement for women's political equality. She says, indeed, if women remained forever burdened by incessant childbirths and frequent miscarriages, they would hardly be able to exercise the political rights they might win. And so I think we can understand what Davis is saying here, maybe by analogy to one of the prerequisites of participating in politics in ancient Greece. Now, Angela Davis is very much still alive. She is a philosopher who studied with um, some of the most prominent philosophers of the 20th century. She was born in 1944 in Birmingham, Alabama, and did her got her PhD in philosophy, studying with, among people, Herbert Marcuse, who was one of the most prominent figures of the Frankfurt School in Germany. She went and studied in Germany, and as a student of Marcuse, of the Frankfurt School, Angela Davis was a is sorry. Um, when we think of Angela Davis, we think of perhaps particularly the figure from the 60s and 70s and then 80s, but she is very much still an active intellectual, still writing books, still very much on the scene. So forgive me for putting her in the past tense. It's just because of the outsized influence that she had in the 60s and especially 70s. Studying with the Frankfurt School under Marcuse, Angela Davis became a Marxist, and is one of the most interesting uh, sort of intersections of Marxist economic theory and the struggle for Black civil rights, and a theorist of racial equality, and Black rights and Black empowerment. So, Black Marxism, Angela Davis is a major figure in this. Uh, Now, all that to say that my analogy to ancient Greece is something that she would have been very well aware of, and uh, the argument um, that political equality necessitates uh, reproductive rights and the ability to plan pregnancies and to um, right be able to decide what to do with your body. Uh, for example, have an abortion uh, is analogous to the idea in Greek democracy that in order to participate in politics, you had to have a uh, certain degree of freedom. In order to be an active member in Greek democracy, to participate, to vote, to be part of discourse, you had to be a man. Um, but not just a man, you had to be a landowning man. And not just a landowning man, but a landowning man who had sufficient workforce, people working for him, laborers, to work the fields, to provide the landowner with enough free time to go participate in politics. In short, to participate in politics requires having free time, having the time and the energy to actually participate in politics. And so, if women ever hoped to genuinely achieve political equality, that is, to be, members of Congress, to be, aspire to the presidency, to hold any kind of political office, and even to participate in politics through organizing, etc. To be politically active, you need a certain kind of freedom, uh, free time, if nothing else. And Davis's point is, if you are, uh, how does she put it, right? Forever burdened by incessant childbirths and frequent miscarriages, then you are constantly occupied with other things, right? If um, you have no control over um, when you get pregnant, and if you're unable to terminate those pregnancies if you choose, then you get all of your time is consumed with pregnancy, childbirth, child rearing. You don't have the free time to participate in politics. So, Davis's sort of assumption, um, and I think it's a justified assumption, is that in order to strive for genuine political equality, women have to have autonomy, right? Um, and so the beginning assumption is that reproductive rights, birth control, the right to an abortion is inherently and necessarily a question of women's autonomy, right? Uh, Allowing women to have the autonomy to choose for themselves whether or not to have an abortion. Uh, if women are not granted that autonomy, if there is a law prohibiting uh, them from making that sort of choice, right, denying them that autonomy, then they aren't fully political actors. They can't be fully political actors if you can't, decide uh, if you can't make choices about um, how your life will unfold when you'll have children, whether or not you'll have children, that sort of thing, you don't have autonomy or the ability to genuinely participate in politics, right? Uh, she goes on, right? Women's liberation was not just about achieving the right to vote and achieving political equality. It was also about women's right to participate in the labor force, to get jobs, and right to be independent. Um, Again, to have autonomy. Uh, so. Uh, Again, women's liberation is about uh, granting autonomy to individual women, and that women could unite in solidarity to fight for their individual autonomy, uh, and to be politically active. So, uh, this dream of autonomy, of independence, uh, meant the freedom to uh, be employed, right? To go get a job, to provide for yourself, to not be dependent on a husband or a man. Uh, right? If women are unable to work, then they are entirely dependent on men. They have no autonomy. And so, in addition to political equality, it's about the opportunity to get jobs and have careers. So she goes on 356. Women's new dreams of pursuing careers and other paths of self development outside marriage and motherhood could only be realized if they could limit and plan their pregnancies. Right? Uh, in the first decades of the 20th century, long before there was anything like maternity leave or any provisions for working women who were pregnant. Being pregnant and having children essentially meant it would be impossible to have a job, right? To get a job or hold a job. And right, pregnancy, motherhood uh, were mutually exclusive with pursuing a career and, as she says, other paths of self-development. So birth control was a necessity for political equality and for uh, women's independence with respect to work and career. Um, Now, this idea that uh, birth control uh, is inherently connected to um, women's liberation, women's rights, uh, we might assume that this uh, right to birth control, to reproductive rights, choices, uh, would be um, extended to all women. So she writes on 352, going back a little bit. Since the right of birth control is obviously advantageous to women of all classes and races, it would appear that even vastly dissimilar women's groups would have attempted to unite around this issue. In reality, however, the birth control movement has seldom succeeded in uniting women of different racial backgrounds, and rarely have the movement's leaders popularized the genuine concerns of working class women. Now, uh, um, what Davis is pointing out here is that uh, birth control is advantageous to women of all classes and races, insofar as it is necessary for the autonomy of any kind of person, any woman, right? However, she says, in reality, right, the birth control movement has seldom succeeded in uniting women of different racial backgrounds. In other words, the movement for women's emancipation, women's liberation, uh, has, from its inception, uh, often excluded, as I said, Black women, and has primarily been uh, uh, focused on white women, and in particular, uh, wealthy white women, right? It does not unite white women with women of different racial backgrounds, and it doesn't take the concerns of working class women into account, right? Now, this failure on the part of the movement for women's rights uh, is um, one of the reasons why in the 70s there became a movement by a movement for what is now um, well known as intersectionality. And intersectionality was uh, an idea developed by the Combahee River Collective, which was a group of Black women, most notably Barbara Smith. Uh, and the argument of the Combahee River Collective was that uh, these individual movements for rights and empowerment um, were often seen as being mutually exclusive. The movement um, for Black rights, the civil rights movement, uh, Barbara Smith and the Combahee River Collective asserted, often marginalized and didn't take into account or take seriously uh, the fight for women's rights. And similarly, the fight for women's rights often didn't take into account the movement for Black rights. And so the idea of intersectionality is to show how the fight for Black civil rights and the fight for women's rights are intersectional, right? They are connected, that the same power that oppresses Black Americans also oppresses women in general, right? Uh, Now, this exclusion of or alienation of Black women from the women's rights movement uh, has its roots in the first decades of the 20th century, but it flares up again in the 1970s. And it's the 70s that most concerns Davis in this essay, but she wants to understand what's happening in the 1970s through the lens of the 1910s and teens. So she writes, when questions were raised about the absence of racially oppressed women in both the larger movement and in the abortion rights campaign, in the 1970s. They said it was because Black women were overburdened with racial equality, right? That the reason why um, Black women weren't um, as engaged in the fight uh, for abortion rights, birth control rights, reproductive rights in the 70s. Um, the argument went was because Black women were busy with the civil rights movement, right, and fighting for Black rights. That is the story, Davis says, that white women told themselves in the 1970s. She goes on, the truth lay buried in the ideological underpinnings of the birth control movement itself, right? It's not that Black women were, too busy fighting for racial equality to fight for gender equality. It was the reason why Black women were hesitant or apprehensive about the movement for birth control in the 1970s, uh, as Davis says, lay buried in the ideological underpinnings of that movement. Is to say, there is a history to this movement and a racist history to this movement that the white women that were leading the movement for reproductive rights in the 70s were unaware of. She goes on, the failure of the abortion rights campaign to conduct a historical self evaluation led to a dangerously superficial appraisal of Black people's suspicious attitudes toward birth control in general. Right? Uh, so now there's a lot going on in this essay, uh, but there are a few things I want to touch on before we move into the main sort of section of the article. Uh, and let's say that Black women, um, in fact, Davis points out, had a uh, great stake in the legalization of abortions because it was Black women, she says Black women and Puerto Rican women, who uh, overwhelmingly uh, were the ones suffering and dying due to the lack of legal abortion. On page 354, she says, during the several years preceding the decriminalization of abortions, some 80% of the deaths caused by illegal abortion involved Black and Puerto Rican women. Uh, so here we have a clear example of, systemic racism or the way that the system privileges white people over Black people. Uh, this is not to say that there are not obstacles to white people, that white people don't have to deal with obstacles and don't have a hard time. Right? The argument about white privilege is not to say white people have it easy, white people have been given everything, they haven't earned what they have. Is to say that uh, that non-white people face a large host of obstacles that white people do not face. And because they don't have to face those obstacles, white people are often blind to the additional obstacles that are presented to non-white people. Um, so, right? The fact that 80% of the deaths caused by illegal abortion involve Black and Puerto Rican women means that, um, you know, certainly uh, Black and Puerto Rican women had a great interest in the legalization of abortion because illegal abortions um, were extremely deadly for them, much more deadly for them than they were for white women, and in particular for wealthier white women. Right, wealthier white women who had the means to travel to states where abortion was legal, uh, and right had other means at their disposal. Right, so who suffered most disproportionately from illegal the federal criminalization of abortion? It was Black and Puerto Rican women. Um, now, uh, with that said, um, we've also seen that uh, the movement for women's empowerment, women's liberation, uh, was from the beginning about uh, political equality and the right to pursue a career. Right? And so, uh, one of the arguments in the 70s also was that the right to abortion uh, would be economically beneficial for women. And it would allow more women to pursue um, politics. Right now, for Black women, Davis argues, uh, this argument didn't make uh, very much sense. Um, right? She says, uh, you know, about this idea that having fewer children would lead to better economic conditions. She writes, as if having fewer children could create more jobs, higher wages, better schools, etc. Right? That for Black women, the idea that abortion rights would lead to better economic conditions. Um, maybe there was some truth to that. However, the obstacles to economic success for Black women were many more than just the inability to have an abortion, right? Um, there were for Black women in particular, Black people in general, many fewer jobs that were available to them. The wages were lower. The schools in Black neighborhoods were um, underfunded, less good, and there were fewer opportunities for higher education, um, especially in the 60s and 70s. And so, this idea that, economic uh, liberation would come through abortion rights was, tenuous. It didn't make very much sense or as much sense to Black women as it did to white women, right? Wealthy white women um, who, uh, right, whose primary objective was, right, furthering their careers. And this leads to another reason Davis thinks uh, that that Black women were less enthusiastic about the right to an abortion or the movement for reproductive rights in the 70s than than white women were or white women wanted them to be. Uh, and that is that the Davis argues to Black women, the movement for reproductive rights in the 70s seemed to be an advocacy of abortion. Uh, and right, to be claiming that abortion was in some way good. And this framing of abortion, Davis says, ignores the long history of uh, what abortion meant in the Black community and how Black women perceived abortions, what their experience of abortion was. And that, right, if you are advocating abortion as a way to ensure or give yourself a better opportunity to get a promotion or something. That is, Davis thinks, um, not going to resonate with Black women. She writes, abortions and infanticides among Black women were acts of desperation, motivated not by the biological birth process, but by the oppressive conditions of slavery. Most of these women, no doubt, would have expressed their deepest resentment had someone hailed their abortions as a stepping stone toward freedom. Right? Abortions were something that were done out of necessity. They were acts of desperation, uh, and right, you needed an abortion because you didn't want to bring, um, going back to the time of slavery. Many Black women would abort because they didn't want to bring children into a life of slavery, right? It had nothing to do with furthering their careers. It had nothing to do with their liberation. It was a tragic and horrible act of desperation and an unwillingness to bring a child into these conditions. And similarly, after slavery ended in the Jim Crow era, and throughout the second half of the 19th and first half of the 20th century, abortions would have been acts of desperation because of an inability to raise a child, right? To provide food for a child, to provide clothing for a child, to provide housing for a child, right? So abortion is not viewed within by Black women, Davis writes, as a stepping stone toward freedom, but as an act of desperation. Right? Now, this is important it's important to understand this for the rest of the argument. And I'm going to leave off here with one more thought to transition. And returning to the 19 aughts and teens, and that history in the women's movement that led to suspicion in the 1970s. She writes on 354, this movement, the movement for women's liberation in the 19 teens, this movement, for example, had been known to advocate involuntary sterilization, a racist form of mass birth control. All right, so we'll leave it off there for now. I have to go do office hours, but we'll pick it up with the first decades of the 20th century and how the movement for reproductive rights got mixed up with an agenda of sterilizing the poor, sterilizing in particular Black women, and how the um, movement for women's liberation um, uh, took on a explicitly racist aspect.